Well, hi everyone. I'm Lisa Harvey-Smith, Australia's Women in STEM ambassador, and thank you so much for joining us today for this special conversation. We're going to celebrate International Day of Women and Girls in Science today with a special guest, Dr. Allison Master, who's joining us. She's director of the Identity and Academic Motivation Lab at the University of Houston, where she studies students' identity, how they view themselves and their social groups, and how that affects their motivation in school from preschool right up to university through all education levels. So, Allison, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Great. Well, look, first, tell us a little bit about yourself and your career journey and how you've got to where you are today.
Yeah, so, when I think about what really got me interested in gender and motivation, I was really good at math as a child. And when I was in middle school, I would do like the math competitions. And I was usually the only girl on the team, and my gender would be really salient. So everybody was always pointing out, oh, you're the only girl. How do you feel about that? And to me, it made me so mad as a middle school student, because I wanted to be recognized for me and my accomplishments, and not seeing through my gender, which I think applies to a lot of us. And so after that, when I went to graduate school, I was interested in finding ways to help students' motivation in school. And so my graduate advisor was Carol Dweck at Stanford, who's famous for her research on growth mindsets and sort of how we can help all students achieve their full potential. And then after that, I did a postdoctoral fellowship where I really started to get into STEM education and looking at the gender inequities within STEM. And to me, it was a really natural extension of that, because I was looking at the ways that, our society places these barriers in front of girls and in front of other groups like minoritized students that prevent them from achieving their full success and realizing, all the possibilities that they could see for themselves. And so my work since then has really been about how can we remove those barriers and counter those stereotypes and give all students the possibilities to succeed.
Oh, that's great. It's so important, that educators have a framework from research to understand how they can best help their students achieve their full potential. You mentioned a growth mindset, actually. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that? And I know teachers are very, knowledgeable about this idea of a growth mindset, but, what sort of insights did you gain from your research?
Yeah, so, we've done a lot of research with middle school students and high school students. And in terms especially of STEM education, we found that growth mindsets are really important for girls in STEM, because there are those negative stereotypes about ability, maybe that boys are supposedly better than girls in math. And I feel like when you have a growth mindset and you believe that your ability and your capabilities can change and improve, it just makes the stereotypes so much less powerful, because who you are is not set in stone and your destiny is not set in stone, and you have the power to work hard, to get help from your teachers, and to get better in STEM fields. And so I'm working on a paper with a former graduate student right now where we're looking at how adolescent girls who have a growth mindset are less impacted by these STEM stereotypes. So I think growth mindsets are helpful for everyone. I use my own growth mindset all the time. I'm always reminding myself about my growth mindset. But I think, when we're in those really vulnerable situations where we doubt ourselves or we're worried about how other people see us, then I think the growth mindset helps us even more.
Yeah, I think I can reflect on that as an adult, thinking about sometimes you get angry or frustrated with the situation. You just think, no, let's take this step by step. Let's think about how we can solve this problem. And I think, we can all learn from that. Look, your research really encompasses, I guess if you wanted to put it in a nutshell, you would talk about stereotypes and the effect of stereotypes on young people in education and STEM. So, tell us a bit about your research and other research on gender stereotypes in STEM and how that can actually affect young people.
Yeah, so, there's been a lot of research that these negative gender stereotypes can discourage girls from pursuing STEM fields. And, when I started doing this research 20 years ago, I was working with a researcher who was studying stereotype threat, which is this idea that, these stereotypes about ability, that boys are better at math than girls, they can really undermine girls' confidence and lead to them performing less well because they're worried about these stereotypes. And in my more recent research, I've been looking at a different kind of stereotype that I think is just as impactful and maybe more impactful in some ways, which is these gender stereotypes about who's interested in STEM. Because we also sort of have these beliefs, especially when you think about like computer science or engineering, we're just like, boys just like those activities more. They like those classes more. They're just more naturally interested in these fields than girls are. And so when we have this stereotype and when girls internalize that stereotype, it changes the choices that they make and the opportunities that they choose for themselves too. So our research has found that these stereotypes about who's interested in STEM are actually more predictive of students' interest in going into STEM compared to those negative stereotypes about ability. So the more the girls believe in this stereotype, the less interested they are themselves in these STEM fields and the less they feel like they belong in these STEM fields as well.
So in that kind of research, I'm a, sort of a layperson in how it's done, but I believe it's, they sort of talk to the children beforehand. They introduce a stereotype, perhaps a negative one for girls, and then they test, and the test results are worse than when they didn't introduce the negative stereotype, right? So you can actually, almost as the teacher in that classroom, as the adult in the classroom, you can really unwittingly introduce this kind of awful feeling in young people that they don't belong in that subject, or they're going to perform worse in a test, and you can actually make them perform worse. It's not really, a test doesn't really measure innate ability. Is that kind of a fair way to describe it?
I think so. And it's sort of, the more worried you are about this test, the more invested you are in doing well, it can sort of make you even more nervous about doing well. And that interferes with how well you can do on the test. And, the way that these stereotypes come up, they're so insidious that like they can be really, really subtle. And so examine, for example, saying something like girls are just as good as boys at math is still reinforcing the stereotype, because it's saying that, you might think that there is a difference, and what we're doing is that boys are the standard and we're comparing girls to boys. So something like that. And even just, the ways that we highlight gender in classrooms, where we're like girls over here, boys over here, we're telling kids that gender matters in the classroom.
Yeah, that's really interesting. In my work as Women in STEM ambassador, often I'm asked to go and talk to the girls about something. And I always worry with those situations that you are highlighting gender unnecessarily. And then, you are introducing those sort of subtle cues that gender matters. And I do worry about that. So maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that later in terms of the types of programs that might be suitable in classrooms to encourage everyone to engage in STEM. On a broader scale, though, how can people like educators or parents actually practically counteract these stereotypes? What's a good thing for people to be doing to counteract these stereotypes?
Yeah, so when I think about why stereotypes are so powerful, there's a TED Talk by Chimamanda Adichie. She's a Nigerian author and novelist, and I really love how she talks about stereotypes, because she says, the problem with stereotypes is not that they're untrue, but that they're incomplete. And so they take one story and they make it the only story. So something I've been trying to focus on when I talk to teachers and parents is, all right, how many stories can we tell about who does STEM? And, how many more of these stories can we add to that dominant narrative that it's for boys, it's for men, that it's for this one type of person. So we need to be telling stories about women in these roles, about, people from very diverse backgrounds with different interests and attitudes. And, just by showing these kinds of role models, showcasing their stories, I think that's a good way to counter a lot of these stereotypes. And, something else that I think about, especially in terms of these stereotypes about who's interested, I think, as adults, we've grown up with these gender stereotypes so much that it's really hard to even counter them. So I'm a parent, I have a son and a daughter. We go to a lot of birthday parties, and I'm buying a lot of birthday presents for kids. And I'm always like, okay, especially for preschool children, toys are so gendered. And, the Toy Stories used to be divided into like the boys' toys and the girls' toys. And I think retailers are sort of realizing not that they shouldn't be doing that anymore, but it's still, for little girls, we give them arts and crafts or dolls and things like that. And for boys, we can give them robots and, circuit kits and things like that. So it's hard for me as a parent, to counter the stereotypes in the gifts that I buy for other kids, but I try. And I try with my own kids of, when we're signing up for summer camps, I try to not stereotype what I expect them to be interested in, but, offer them both opportunities to, to sign up for coding camp or for these after school programs, to really give all the opportunities to all of the children so that we're not limiting their opportunities by the expectations and the assumptions that we make about what we think they're going to like and going to enjoy.
That's so true. And it's really interesting that in Australia we have a data source from the government about STEM, and it does things like surveys of young people and teachers and parents and their attitudes about STEM and their assumptions. And it sort of rung true what you said there. In Australia, they measured the STEM interest of young people. And the girls were just as interested in STEM as boys. But the teachers' impression or assumptions about the STEM interest was very, very different. So the teachers thought the girls were a lot less interested than they actually were. So, that as adults, we've got to stop putting our feelings and our thoughts and assumptions on children. We've got to let them blossom. And that's really... I don't know what is wrong with adults, but we gather some funny thoughts throughout our lives, and we've got to stop putting those on young people, I think. So very interesting. Just for the educators watching as well, we do have a pre-program called Future You Australia, and the website is futureyouaustralia.com.au, and we do show a broad range of STEM role models, so young people can actually see those people in the roles, and we explain very carefully the career paths as well. So that's just one way that people can access that kind of information and show that anyone can be in STEM, and there are many different pathways, not just universities, but vocational training and that kind of thing too. So from STEM stereotypes to early childhood, something interesting, I read one of your papers recently. You did a study on computational thinking and gender. It's particularly in early childhood education. So can you tell us a bit about that? What is computational thinking, firstly, and why is it really important? And what did your study find?
Yeah. So, first I want to say computational thinking, it sounds very fancy and complicated, but it's really very simple. And it involves a lot of things that early childhood educators are already doing with their students, and they're just not labeling it as computational thinking. So some of it involves like the ideas and the concepts behind computer science, but that's just things like making patterns. And, preschool teachers and kindergarten teachers, they're talking about patterns with young children all the time, or, thinking abstractly. And then so those kinds of ideas and concepts are part of it. And then also like just these processes of like things that we do, like tinkering and creating, which is absolutely a normal part of early childhood education, and things like collaborating and persevering, great things that we want kids to be doing anyway. And then also like debugging, which is where you're just sort of figuring out where you went wrong and fixing that problem. So these are really easy things for teachers to realize what they're already doing, and then just by labeling that, they can sort of emphasize it to children more. But so what our study looked at was how interested children were and how capable they felt when it came to part of computational thinking, which is learning how to code. And so for me, the best thing about what we found was what we did not find, which was we found no gender differences. So this was with students in grades 1 through 3 in the US, so about ages 6 through 8. And we didn't find any differences for these children in how interested they were in coding or how good they thought they were at coding. And this was in a school district where all the kids were doing coding through their library classes. So they were doing, maybe an hour of code through code.org here in the US, or just, some kinds of simple things like Scratch or Scratch Junior, those kinds of things. And so what I think is so great about it is that, definitely later on after children develop, these gender differences show up and they get big. So in the US, By the time they get to college, I think only about 20% of computer science majors are women. So this gender difference shows up along the way. But in early childhood, it's not there yet. These children, they're not paying attention to the gender stereotypes, and they believe in themselves. So I think, one of the implications of that is how important it really is to get children involved in all kinds of STEM activities from an early age, so that they're having fun with these activities and that they know what computer science and engineering, what that means, what it involves, and all the fun ways that teachers can do that in their classrooms, even with young children.
Yeah, it's a great message that we sort of reinforce here in Australia a lot, because we found in our data that at year 12, so 16, 17, 18 years old, that kind of age, it's the students who choose maths and science, there's pretty much a gender balance now in Australia, and certainly people doing degrees, more women than men do science degrees. So it's very much not the area we need to focus on. It's computing and it's engineering. The curriculum doesn't mention a lot about engineering in particular. It doesn't name it. As you said with computational thinking, that we don't really have the vocabulary to describe this stuff. We might be doing it, but it's really good to I talk to teachers a lot about naming engineering, and when a child is maybe creating a model or designing something, say, hey, you're an engineer, so to actually give them that sort of knowledge and that understanding. So I think the STEM acronym kind of hides a bit of nuance, doesn't it, within the subjects. So what's your sort of feelings and thoughts on why the engineering and computational sciences are so difficult to shift when we've got this sort of a bit of an easier ride with maths and science?
Yeah, and we definitely have the same situation in the United States with math and science. I think in biology majors, women are overrepresented, in health and pre-medicine here as well. And when we measure gender stereotypes among adolescents here, we actually find that their math stereotypes favor girls. So they think girls are better and more interested in math compared to boys. So we're finding, definitely gender parity or stereotypes favoring girls for math and science, but computer science and engineering look so different, so strongly these male stereotypes in those domains. And so one of the things that I think is really different is that in elementary school, middle school, high school, kids are taking math and science classes all the time. So they're constantly having those experiences. And girls, they do really well in school, that they typically get higher grades in math and science classes than boys in a lot of, this K through 12 education. So I think students are sitting in those math and science classrooms, they're looking around and they're seeing girls be really successful at those subjects. But in contrast, they're not taking computer science classes for the most part. They're not taking engineering classes. And so they just don't have those same opportunities to see girls being successful and enjoying those subjects. So I think the lack of experience that they have is a really big factor. And we actually have a paper that just got accepted at the Journal of Developmental Psychology, and we tracked kids' gender stereotypes in 4 different STEM fields across the calendar year. And this is kids in elementary school and middle school. And what we found was that in almost all the cases, their stereotypes changed to favor girls more and more over that year. And so what we think is going on is that they're in these classrooms and they're looking around and they're seeing girls succeeding.
So does that mean in the curriculum we need to sort of spend a bit more time talking and thinking about maybe the interaction between computer science and other subjects and engineering and other subjects? I mean, what's the solution for this, do you think?
Yeah, I think that incorporating computer science and engineering education into elementary school in a way that's mandatory for everybody, I think is really, really important and would be really helpful, because this is the age before those stereotypes have really taken root and before they really start to affect girls' choices. And so that's the key time when we can give girls these positive experiences so they can, develop that self-concept of seeing themselves as successful in that field and as belonging when they do those kinds of activities. And I think things start to get, more intense for girls in middle school. So in the study I was just talking about, the one subject where we didn't find the stereotypes grew more to favor girls more over the course of the year was in computer science in middle school. And so, our concern there is that maybe when, these middle school students are taking these coding classes, if girls aren't finding those classes interesting, if they're not being engaged in the subject matter, if they're worried about those stereotypes, that their sort of negative reactions within the classroom might be reinforcing the stereotypes too. So that's why I think really elementary school is the very best time to get kids involved in these STEM activities.
Yeah, and I mean, from my perspective as a physicist, in the real world, in science and in problem solving and engineering and things, in the workplace, you'll be using computers to solve math problems. So you won't be using a pen and paper. Well, maybe theoretical physicists would argue with me, but generally you're using computers. So incorporating computing into more areas of the curriculum, I think, would also contribute, because you're sort of normalizing that use of computers to do calculations, to solve problems, and that's very much what we do in the real world as researchers. We've all had very long Excel spreadsheets, I'm sure. As well as other coding ways of coding. So look, we're nearly running out of time, but I just wanted to go back to solutions and ask you about any more tips for educators or teachers. What would a good STEM classroom look like that's really inclusive for all students, or a STEM program in a school? So what are some of your ideas?
Yeah, well, I think making it mandatory for everyone is really important, because for some of our studies with middle school students, they notice when girls are underrepresented in like elective computer science classes, and that to them is a sign that they don't belong and that they're not going to like that class either. So we've been looking at how girls being underrepresented sort of reinforces those stereotypes and makes it harder to counteract them. So, making these programs for everyone. So, STEM for everyone, I think is really, really important. And so I think getting all of those kids doing those kinds of experiences early, here in the US, Hour of Code is great, Scratch Junior is great. There's just so many fun ways and programs to get kids doing these kinds of activities early on. And, I mentioned also the growth mindsets earlier, and I think making growth mindsets really clear in that classroom environment matters a lot, so that girls know that it's okay to make mistakes. And that doesn't mean that you don't belong, that it's sort of, when you think about computer science and engineering, making mistakes is a normal part of the process. And then it's great. It's
essential.
It's essential. It's how you figure things out, right? So I think we need to normalize making mistakes. And I think that also is really important, especially for girls who, a lot of girls have that tendency to want to be perfect, to not make mistakes, to seek approval from others and from their teachers. So I think teachers need to send really clear messages about, valuing taking risks and experimenting and, pushing the boundaries of what kids can do.
That's great. Look, Dr. Allison Master, thank you so much for joining me today for International Day of Women and Girls in Science. And look, for teachers or others watching online, please visit the link so you can look at more information. Happy International Day of Women and Girls in Science. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much for having me.